Welcome back to One on One, New York's longest running sports call-in show here on Facebook Live with Andrew Posadas, and now joined by Kelly Bright. We're going to talk about the Atlantic 10 and the news that you just heard from Emmanuel Berbari and Ed Cole, the interim athletics director, about the suspension, or we should say the postponement of fall sports until at least the winter. And we're going to talk about the fallout of this, how this affects student athletes. Kelly is one of them. But first, let's hear from the A10 commissioner. That's Bernadette McGlade. Let's hear from her. Alex, I believe we have some audio from you.
There would have to be a significant upward trend in all of the impacts that we're seeing right now as regards to assuring the health and the safety of not only our students, but our campus communities as well. There are a lot of issues that are interrelated with all of these decisions right now, and even our colleges and universities opening up. So the decision is going to be literally dictated by what's going on with the virus, with the pandemic.
And we have another bite from Bernadette. That is on how the virus has forced their hand here, which is, of course, not news to any of us, guys, how the virus has been the dictating force. Let's hear one more on the potential for conference championships in the Atlantic 10 from the same commissioner, Bernadette McGlade.
There's no question about it. If there are hotspots, i.e., and that means the pandemic could be still raging in different parts of the footprint, I would say that we won't be competing. We won't have a championship. So it would be as simple as that. We wouldn't be taking any of our student athletes or having any championships, if the environment isn't, with, great assurance for the safety and well-being of, all the teams, all the athletes, and all of the support personnel. As many of you know, it takes a village, so to speak, when you have these conference championships, and a lot of our volunteers and, part-time help. We have to take their safety and health into consideration as well. So we just simply wouldn't venture there.
So that's the voice of the A10 commissioner, Bernadette McGlade. And I want to start with you, Kelly. You're a student athlete. You play softball here at Fordham. You haven't yet seen news on a spring season. The hope is to be able to play spring sports at Fordham, but of course, your previous season was cut short by the pandemic when it hit in March. What has this process been like as a student athlete? How difficult is it to potentially lose a second season and just losing that half of the first season? What was that whole process like?
Yeah, well, Chris, I know at the time when our season was cut back in March, we obviously didn't know anything about this disease that we know now. At that time, it wasn't nearly as widespread. We didn't know how severe it was. So I think a lot of us were a lot more confused, a little bit more upset about the decision. We didn't really understand,
right,
I guess, the whole thought process behind it. Obviously, now we've seen how much this virus has affected the whole world, and especially the U.S., which I know yesterday we had, I think it was at 3.5 million cases in the U.S. alone. So obviously this thing has grown, and we're still learning so much about it. There's still so much we don't know. So that being said, it's obviously very heartbreaking as an athlete to have your season canceled. I mean, anyone who's playing at that level, anyone who's playing at college, sports is such a major part of your life. I know for me, I wouldn't be at Fordham if it wasn't for softball. That's part of the reason I came. Kind of like a lot of people on WFUV came here for WFUV. It's just such an important part of a lot of these athletes' lives that having it taken away is a pretty heartbreaking, frustrating situation. That being said, like you heard Ed Cole say in the interview with Emmanuel, the priority and safety of health of these athletes, that has to come first. So I think people are a lot more understanding of the decision now than they were, but we are definitely still, fingers crossed, hoping that we can figure out a way to play safely in the near future.
And Kelly, Ed and Emmanuel were talking, and Ed spoke about a upcoming town hall meeting with all the student athletes. Being that you're part of that community, when that town hall meeting does happen, what questions do you hope that Ed and the entire athletic department can answer? What are the questions that you hope they address and have for you and the rest of the student athletes at Fordham?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, like I said, we really don't know that much. I know my team just had a meeting a few days before this news was broken. So at that point, we still thought we had like a fall season. So there's a bunch of questions. I mean, one, I know Ed Cole did say there's going to be practices in the fall. Is that a reality? Are we actually going to have practices? What are those practices going to look like? Can we use the weight room? Is that going to be different? Like, obviously social distancing and all that, all these protocols, what are those going to look like? And then last year, I know for the spring athletes, they were all granted another year of eligibility. Is that going to happen again with the fall athletes? And let's say, God forbid, that the spring season gets canceled again. Are you going to give these players another year? What's that going to look like? I mean, a lot of, especially with scholarships, a lot of players are here because, I mean, they're being able to afford universities because of these athletic scholarships. So our school is going to be able to keep up with that cost, and what's it going to look like for players who maybe want to opt out of their seasons? Are they going to be able to do that without losing their athletic scholarship?
And to me, Kelly, that's the crux of the issue. That's the most challenging part of this, is that you have college athletes who in addition to being athletes, they're students, and they're in a lot of cases their tuition is dependent on their ability to play a sport at this level. And I don't know how that question gets resolved. If a college athlete does not feel comfortable playing, which is a very valid concern, with the pandemic still rearing in the United States, is that college athlete then do they lose their scholarship? Do they lose their ability to get education at a reasonable cost? And I don't know the answer to that.
And I would add this, Chris, I know we spoke about this, before the show in our, pre-production, but just the fact that before this pandemic had hit, the one question that we had with the NCAA and its student athletes were financial compensation, paying these athletes what they should have, as opposed to just making the scholarship the end all be all of that is what you get for coming here and playing sports at a university. So I think my fear is that in our rush to get college athletics back and to get these seasons back, I think a lot of student athletes might forget about, hey, there's a lot more at stake here. We're not just amateurs. We should be compensated fairly while we're here, and giving a bulk of the revenue to some of these universities who really depend on the athletic departments and what they bring in. So Kelly, my thing is, how do you think student athletes should take the beginning? If you do come back in the spring, how do you feel, how would you yourself or the softball team go about making sure that the idea of players, student athletes being compensated, that doesn't go away and that doesn't get lost in this entire pandemic with everything going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, especially because this pandemic is so much the forefront of on so many people's minds. But I mean, it's kind of like, I know we're talking later about Elena Delle Donne, WNBA, and that kind of thing. Like, these players, while they're not right now, we're not being paid in addition to our scholarships. Like, you are still bringing in revenue for the university, and the NCAA has such a like a tight grip on many of these athletes, especially some more of the revenue generating sports like men's football, college basketball, that kind of thing. So how much freedom are these players really going to have in saying, oh, I don't feel comfortable playing, I want to, like, can I opt out of the season? But at the same time, a lot of these players, I know even just girls on the softball team here at Fordham, if they didn't have some of the scholarship they're getting for to play on the softball team, they wouldn't be able to afford the institution. So, like, how are you going to prioritize school versus athletics? And obviously, this is all going to, I mean, this is, universities are losing lots of money. Teams are being cut. I know Stanford just cut, 11 teams? Ford, unfortunately, has not cut any teams yet, but who knows what could happen, especially if the 2020-2021 seasons, get canceled. So it's pretty scary for athletes when they've already been struggling to fight for more freedom and more
Right.
potential revenue. So I think it's just going to make the fight that much more challenging.
From a purely athletic standpoint, there's certainly all of that, and there's a conversation about health and freedom, and then there's also the question of losing the ability to play your sport and hone your craft. What is it? I mean, what is it like for an athlete to have this unbelievable gap in regimen? Athletes are very regimented about their schedule and their programs, and how often they play and when they're resting and when they're not. And this is something that has been an act of nature that has completely thrown that into the wind. What has that been like as an athlete?
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, it's been pretty frustrating. It's definitely a totally new experience. I mean, a lot of athletes, they come home, they don't have the type of facilities that we had available to us at Fordham, and especially
Right.
with Corona, people like I know I'm in North Carolina, which has spiked recently, so we're pretty much back to almost phase one. So there's no gyms open or anything like that. So like you said, athletes are used to like part of their lives is like training their bodies and practicing their sports and their skills. So not being able to do that the way they're so accustomed doing is it's not only going to have an effect on like their physical performance, but I think the real concern should be mental health. I know like even
Mm.
talking to other girls on my team and talking to other athletes, like the mental aspect of just not knowing if you're going to play again, not having that part of your life that for so many athletes, including myself, is such like a rock for you that it's, I mean, it's definitely like an uncharted territory. And I think the mental implications are going to be almost more serious than the physical ones.
And just to add to that, you think of some of the upperclassmen, the seniors who had their seasons cut short, who couldn't go to an NCAA tournament or couldn't play in a postseason. And now coming into this, there's still uncertainty for seniors. And Kelly, you mentioned that mental health. How affected do you think a senior will be? Especially think about yourself. If you couldn't play your senior year, what toll would that take on you knowing that you couldn't give that final year of your eligibility and do what you love?
Right. I think it's just heartbreaking. I know we have two seniors on my team. They both are planning on returning for this next season, and I literally can't even imagine if we were to have this next season canceled. I mean, they've just sacrificed like moving on to their careers basically to come back for that one more shot. So not being able to do that would just be so heartbreaking. And same thing, like I'm going to be a senior, and I know I have a big senior class. We have some, you know, we've always had big hopes, dreams for the senior year, and like the fact that that could all go out the door depending on how this pandemic grows or changes. So it's very scary. It's there's not, but at the end of the day, there's not much we can do besides wear a mask, practice social distancing, do whatever we can to help give this pandemic a chance to decrease, flatten the curve, which we clearly couldn't do originally. So it's just a lot of trying to focus on controlling what you can control.
Right, because so much of this is out of our control. As difficult as it is, guys, I think Fordham Athletics and I think the Atlantic 10 and the Patriot League are doing what they have to do. This is in the best interest of student athletes. This is in the best interest of the health of everyone involved with sports. And you really hope that this becomes more than a financial consideration, because when it becomes numbers on a page, it may be in Fordham's interest to make difficult decisions about some of its athletic programs, whether or not the health crisis allows it. So it is a difficult process for everything. We actually have a question in the comments for Kelly, and the question is, how have you as an athlete stayed motivated to keep training at home despite all of the uncertainty and lack of this important necessary equipment?
Yeah, so that's a great question. When I first came back from the pandemic, I was like so frustrated. I was like, I just couldn't even foresee a future, what I was gonna do. Like I was just so, I guess like dejected. But as time grew on, like talking to my teammates, talking to my coaches, we've all just kind of developed this mentality, like, all right, if we're gonna have longer to go to our season, that's just more time to prepare. And I think a lot of people are just like they miss their sports so much that you just want to do everything you can to like be ready when the time comes. So it's definitely been a grind. Like I know it's especially having to like do like body weight workouts instead of being in the weight room with teammates and having to like hit off a team more than I play softball. So, not being able to practice as a team, but doing more individual skills. But a lot of these athletes are just already so motivated for their sports. And I think we're just all hoping that we can be ready when the time does come.
Yeah, and I mean, Chris, and just to go on, it just feels like fall sports aren't going to happen. I think we're just waiting for a huge conference, a Power 5 conference like the ACC or the SEC to say, hey, football is not happening this fall. I think it's going to take that big domino because we're seeing these smaller conferences start to postpone and cancel fall sports or save them for the spring. I think it's just a matter of time before we hear from the SEC or from the Pac-12. And from there, we can just ultimately all punt on fall sports and save it for the spring.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we've seen, you know, the Ivy League was the first among smaller conferences to cancel their fall season. It was no surprise that the Patriot League and the Atlantic 10 followed, but I completely agree with you that, you know, we still haven't heard from the SEC or the ACC. You've heard from the Big Ten and the Pac-12 saying we're going to do non-conference. I believe the MAC said the same. So there is this effort. I don't want to call it a fantasy because I understand where it comes from. There's not just money in this. There's also a lot of passion. I mean, this is the same thing with punting on a baseball season. These are difficult decisions also because, you know, yes, it's financial and there's no question about that there's more money in the Big Ten. And as a result, they're going to do everything in their power to stage a season. But there's also a love for the game that a lot of people have to give up in conferences that produce professional athletes and that basically that have the sort of attention and TV ratings and they are at a professional caliber of sports. So this is all very difficult, guys.